one player that you really liked this year, and bias aside, we'll push aside the bias. You and I were on a couple of panels together at the Fantasy Football Expo in Canton this year, and one of the questions that we got was one of the players that you were targeting this season. And I was the last one to go. So I'll say that the reason I was wrong about mine was because all of my other players were taken by the time that I had to speak. Because I did bring up Christian Watson as a player that I'm targeting. But you mentioned Sam LaPorta. Okay. I need to know because you have an Iowa background. This is your school. I need to know what they're feeding the tight ends at Iowa. Like, how is this happening? Like, realistically, were you on LaPorta? You know, we all have our biases and we're all having fun with it too, right? Like I jokingly loved Kenny Pickett whenever he was drafted by the Steelers, just because, you know, he it's my school, my alma mater. Yeah. That's like I'm not really as big of a fanatic for the Steelers in particular, you know, growing up in Pittsburgh anymore, because I can't be given this job. You just kind of appreciate other teams a little bit more. So I'm not like if the Steelers lose, I don't really care that much. But when it comes to your alma mater, it's a different deal, right? Like this is your school. There's a lot more pride. And so with the Pickett stuff, it didn't necessarily like seep into my fantasy analysis because it was very obvious that he had some shortcomings. But Sam LaPorta didn't really have many shortcomings as a prospect. I know that you probably were on him a little bit more just naturally because you saw him a lot and all that. But what was it this year in particular where you were just like, I'm drafting Sam LaPorta everywhere?
Yeah, it definitely became a bit for me, right? I didn't intend for it to become a bit. I just it happened to be. I don't begrudge anybody who was not watching Iowa football last year, the year before, this year, right? Like it's not
definitely not this year. Definitely not this year.
It's not like credit to them for finding a way to 10 wins when they cannot score more than 13 points.
It's honestly like the Pittsburgh Steelers of college football. It's the same exact thing. Yeah.
But LaPorta, his last two seasons, the quality of quarterback play at Iowa has not always been great, but it really hit a valley when LaPorta was there. Every good thing he did was after the catch, and it doesn't I don't know. You'd look at the raw stats and you'd be like, 650 yards, that's fine. He did all of the heavy lifting on those 650 yards, right? Like it was just the same screen and the same 5-yard out and 7-yard out that he was catching. Like that's all we could hit. He was a wonderful player after the catch, and the obviously what they've built up at Iowa, and there's, in-game play calling, there's a lot of things that you can point to at Iowa that are not ideal. It might be the best teaching and development program in the country, particularly at specific positions. You think about like some of the big name tight ends that have come through there. Dallas Clark, Dallas Clark was a walk-on linebacker, I want to say. George Kittle arrived as a 180-pound receiver who had no offers.
Right.
So they built those guys. Strength and conditioning program, exceptional coaching in terms of blocking technique, offensive, whatever else you might think about the Ferentz family. Amazing offensive line coaching. And they churn out they also happen to play a sort of simplified pro concept offense where players are ready to go when they hit the NFL. And they might have a year and a half edge in terms of learning curve over the way most tight ends hit the NFL. That wouldn't really shock me. And then I also just thought that Sam LaPorta in particular was stepping into a situation where it was just the path was clear for him. They drafted him to be the guy who played 80% of the snaps, 90% of the snaps. You looked at the production from the year before, and Lions tight ends actually caught 12 touchdown passes if you put them all together. And if that gets funneled to one guy, that's a pretty good opportunity. The other thing I'll say about LaPorta and sort of the readiness of Iowa tight ends generally, I thought the best sign for him in opening week against the defending Super Bowl champs primetime game, it's not just the receiving workload. They got down to the goal line and they ran behind him. They just put the ball in Montgomery's hands behind Sam frickin' LaPorta, and it worked. And that's kind of all you needed to know. Once you saw that, he's not going to come off the field unless he has to. So he's just in a great situation. And I thought his talent level relative to some of the other players at the same position in that rookie class was kind of understated because the quality of the quarterback play and the quality of the offense generally.
Yeah, I'll say this, and as wrong as I was about Christian Watson, My model loved Sam LaPorta, like loved him, and to the point where he was ranked right there, depending on what kind of inputs I put in for Dalton Kincaid because he didn't test. But depending on those inputs, he was right there with Dalton Kincaid. It was like way better than the Musgrave, the Michael Mayer within this class. The one thing that I really realized going into the season, I think it's really easy for us as fantasy analysts to sort of see trends and just kind of bake them into the back of our head and just be like, yeah, this is the way that this is. And that's what I'm speaking on with rookie tight ends, right? Where we just kind of assume that rookie tight ends are bad in fantasy football because they have been bad in fantasy football. But when I really dug into it over the summer, because this was such an insane tight end class, like objectively a very, very good tight end class. So it's just one of those things that nudges you to sort of dig into that research a little bit more. And one of the things that was very, very obvious was that the tight ends who did emerge, because it's not like no rookie tight ends ever did anything well in the NFL. The tight ends who were good, the Jordan Reed or the Evan Ingrams or the Kyle Pitts, they all were running a lot of routes. Shocking. They were able to actually see the field, run routes, get work that way. It's not necessarily that all of them are just so inefficient and bad at the game. And so when you overlay the talent profile, you obviously loving LaPorta for all the reasons you talked about, my model liking LaPorta, when you see the talent on top of the fact that, like you said, the situation in Detroit was pretty awesome. I mean, there wasn't anyone there taking any of those looks. Jameson Williams also had that suspension to start the season, even though that looks like it's not even that meaningful today. But back then it was a little bit more meaningful because we thought that Jameson Williams would probably be a little bit better than how he's performed. It just made a lot of sense. And so now I wonder though, as we move on to 2024, we only have a handful of weeks left in this season. Do you think that what we've seen this year, not just with rookie tight ends, but you see, Trey McBride stepping up and other tight ends that were drafted late kind of having decent enough seasons? Do you think that we're bound to see a shift in ADP? Do you think we're bound to see maybe not so many early round tight end approaches?
That's interesting. I think the thing that drives the early round tight end is really we get this wrong to some extent, right? Because like there has been a case for years for Travis Kelce as a first round tight end, and that case is he's going to double up the production of almost everybody else at the position, and it's this huge edge, and people understand that, but like then the mistakes that we would make is we would think, okay, I missed out on Kelce, I better get the second best tight end. Well, that's not the point. The point was to get the best guy who's crushing everybody else, who has like a whole. You could put two other tight ends in the gap between Kelce and like number two. And now we don't really have that. What we have right now is a whole big bunch of guys with 5 or 6 touchdowns, and the yardage is pretty close. And there's not like man, if I don't get Hawkinson first or I don't get Kelce first, like Kelsey's going to be, what is he, 34? Like he's good. Kelce, at some point we're going to really start talking about Kelsey's age, and he's slowed a little bit. So I think that's what's going to bring it back a little bit. I am super curious. I feel like, I don't know, sometimes I'm in on the young guys. I was obviously in on LaPorta, although the point of LaPorta was getting him in the 10th round or 12th round, not getting him in the 6th round. I have no idea what we're going to do with Bowers when he arrives. Like, is he going to get the same treatment that like Kyle Pitts did, where we're taking him at a spot where he can only, he might be able to earn that back, but it's going to be really, really difficult for him to be a profit at that price. But I do think that this season in particular might change the way we look at rookie tight ends. It'll be like 2014 with receivers, right? Like that year happened, and not all those guys didn't even hold their value necessarily. Right. Like, I don't know, that was as good as Kelvin Benjamin ever got, but like whole bunch. Well, Devontae Adams was in that class too, right? And he didn't do anything as a rookie, but so many guys popped, and then forever since then we've just thought differently about rookies.
Yeah, I think that, I sort of view, because obviously with wide receiver, you're starting more of them, right? There's a higher demand for the position in your fantasy lineup. And so when you get an influx, it may or may, there might be a change in the way that we approach the position in redraft the following year. I think that with like quarterback and with tight end in particular, since you're only starting one, like my theory with quarterbacks and the way that things have been going with the quarterback position, I always think that it's easiest to like start there and then kind of move to other positions because everyone kind of understands inherently what's going on at quarterback. But if you look at like the last 3 or 4 years or whatever, where the higher end quarterbacks truly are giving you an edge, like back in 2015. It literally didn't matter. Like
Yeah.
When I say that on podcasts, I don't think people who are newer to the game truly understand that on Living the Stream that Denny Carter and I host, or my other podcast, we would quite literally stream like QB3, QB4 in points per game every single season. And I'm talking like waiver wire. Nobody wants these guys. It was so easy to match that production off the waiver wire. And it's a lot more difficult to do that now. I'm sure that if any of you are streaming, and I've said this the last, handful of years on the show, but like if you're out there trying to stream today, it's very, very difficult to match Jalen Hurts, to match Josh Allen. You're just not going to do that, right? I mean, realistically, our streamer this year, we don't have the benefit of, picking up CJ Stroud and then saying, oh, he's our streamer the rest of the year. We're obviously going back and picking up, like this week, Kenny Pickett is one of our streamers, right? But regardless of that, you're just not going to find quarterbacks that are going to be very, very strong, and they're going to be lower end QB1s if you're streaming and you're having a decent enough season. And so my take on the quarterback position then is we're not going to see a true change in the market. I don't think. Like next year, I would still, maybe not as high as what we saw this year, but like a Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts will still probably go pretty high. Maybe we see Patrick Mahomes take a step back a little bit just because people are so reactionary. But regardless, we're going to see those guys because they do give you some sort of advantage. When that stops is when we get the right number of quarterbacks being influxed into the league that have the true dual threat ability that can actually give you those high-end QB1 seasons. Like if Justin Fields were a better passer, he would be in that conversation, right? Even if Kyler Murray were a little bit better of a passer, he'd be in that conversation. So that he's just not there yet. They're just not there yet. But we're going to see more and more of these guys, just given the fact that the NFL has taken so much from college with the quarterback position, that eventually there's going to be 12 of them. And when there's 12 of them, and we're in a 12-team league, we can then go back to drafting quarterbacks in the 15th round and not caring about them.
Yeah.
And so with tight end, I do think there might be, because of this rookie class, right? You have Dalton Kincaid now, who looks like a stud. Sam LaPorta looks like a stud. I know Trey McBride's in year 2, but he's looking more and more like a stud. I do think there's some intrigue by, looking at sort of the bottom of the barrel, because historically middle round tight ends, like you mentioned, like after you get out of like Kelsey and maybe Andrews, people are always like forcing the issue at tight end, and that's really getting them into trouble more than anything else, right? Middle round tight ends have sucked historically. Yes. And I do wonder, and you can feel free to chime in. I wonder if this influx of truly talented players, because before we were drafting like Tyler Higbee in the 7th round, like he's not, and even like Greg Olsen, who had a great career, but we were drafting Greg Olsen. I wasn't really drafting him that much, but people were drafting Greg Olsen because of the floor and not the ceiling, right? Yes. They're like, oh, he's going to see a 23% target share in this Carolina offense. So that was despite the fact that there were always like 4 or 5 tight ends. Like it takes so little historically anyway to finish as like a top 10 fantasy tight end, right? So somebody's going to catch 5 touchdown passes and finish with 550 yards and they're the tight end 8. That has always happened. Yes. And that guy's always available on waivers at some point in the season. Yes. And so like, but even that, like when Greg Olsen was being drafted in the middle rounds every year, there was always at least 1 or 2 like athletic tight ends who had like Tyler Eifert or like Jordan Reed, these guys who like would match that production to some degree, right? I do wonder though, like, what do you think of this idea that we have this influx in talent with all these rookie tight ends? We haven't even talked about like Luke Musgrave and Michael Mayer, if they're going to be, I mean, like realistically, Michael Mayer hasn't had that great of a season, but like within the context of history for a tight end, it's really not that bad, right? Like he hasn't had that bad of a year. And I wonder if now we see middle round tight ends do what middle round quarterbacks have done over the last, where they become a little bit more valuable, because they are the guys who, like the Joe Burrows of the world who, they can kind of get there and match the production of the higher end guys. Do you think there's anything to that? Like, or am I just spewing nonsense? No, I don't think that's nonsense at all. I am actually, This is one of my more unpopular ideas, one of my more unpopular takes, but I'm kind of ready to ditch tight end as a position. I like that.
And a lot of it is really just that the guys that we're drafting, and there are exceptions, but there are not many exceptions. The guys that we're drafting are usually they're pretty big slot receivers. They're like Mark Andrews is never not running a route.
Yeah.
And that, which is great. But it's like even those guys kind of get hosed by being called tight ends and not wide receivers because they get on a different like salary scale and all that. Like, I don't know. I'm kind of for the idea of just blending the tight ends in with the receivers, and then we wouldn't have to worry about the people who are putting up, the guys who are delivering the 600-yard 5-touchdown season, who we have to start because they're the tight end 8. We would have to worry about that a little bit less, and we could just treat them all as essentially what they really are, which is professional pass catchers. So I don't know. That's where I've been. There's no chance we're ever doing that at ESPN or Yahoo or any major platform, right? Like people like what they like and they like what they've played for years. So that ain't happening. But custom leagues, I don't know. I'm a big supporter of that. And I feel like we would still, I don't know, we may get to a point where you'd still roster across the league 8 or 10 guys.